One. Welcome back to another episode of Stand on Guard. I'm your host, David Krayden. My guest today is the founder and president of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, John Carpay. And when we come back momentarily, we're discussing the Online Harms Act.
So we are in a very precarious position in this country. We need political change, but we also need the resolve to resist.
Yes, thank you for liking the station. Thank you for subscribing. And thank you for giving us the thumbs up and all your support. And John, we just saw you in Ottawa. Technically, it was CARP last Friday. And you delivered a fantastic address to a standing room only church there. And I think everybody left with a sense that at least somebody out there is organizing resistance to Trudeau's online harms bill. And you talked to a lot of people there, a lot of your supporters, and my wife and I are among those supporters, by the way. We've supported the Justice Center for many years, and I think the work you're doing is phenomenal. But did you leave there with a sense that people felt at least there's hope? We can do something to stop this odious online harms bill.
Well, democracy is a political system that rewards the people who are the most active and the most engaged, and it punishes people who are not active. There's an old French proverb that says, if you don't do politics, then politics will be done unto you. And so we've seen, not only in Canada, but in different countries, when people roll up their sleeves and when you have strong grassroots support for a candidate or for an idea or on an issue, when people are both active and persistent, so they don't give up and quit after a few hours, a few days, a few weeks, but they're willing to stick with an issue for years, you can see positive change. In Alberta, we used to have this premier by the name of Jason Kenney, and he was replaced by somebody named Danielle Smith. And that was because a lot of Albertans were very upset with Jason over breaking his promises to stop the lockdowns, and he just made things worse and broke his promises, and then brought in vaccine passports, etc. And so there's so many examples in throughout history and across the world. If people will roll up their sleeves and engage in the political process, engage in the democratic process, then it is possible to bring about change.
Well, I certainly think you're right. People can fight back, and if they're mobilized and educated, and I think that's part of the process here that you're fulfilling. But I think Trudeau's unalloyed narcissism is part and product of a bill like this. He really thinks he can get away with this, that taking away our free speech and without any kind of resistance. And we're supposed to think this is about protecting children. Although, as you pointed out the other night, all of these laws are already in place to protect children from child pornography and from revenge porn. And for that matter, hate speech. We've already got laws against hate speech. So what is going on with this? We need to do it again. We need to replicate these laws in this online harms package. What are they up to?
Well, currently we've got Section 319 of the Criminal Code makes it illegal to willfully promote hatred against an identifiable group. And that means a section of the public that can be identified on the basis of race, ancestry, ethnicity, skin color, national origin, religion, gender, sexual orientation, gender expression, gender identity. And I might be missing one or two, but it's on these enumerated grounds. So, by the way, it doesn't apply if you were to willfully promote hatred against bankers, for example, and apologies to any bankers that are listening or watching this. But if you were to say that bankers are, a bunch of vile scum and the world would be better without them, or, really nasty words like that. Or if you said that, excuse me, if you made hateful comments about people that did not get the COVID injection back in 2021. And if you said that they were racist, extremist, anti-science, misogynist, it wouldn't apply. So Section 319 makes it illegal to promote hate willfully against an identifiable group based on those characteristics of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual orientation, etc. Now, it's hard to measure, but it probably does not have a huge negative impact on free expression, because most people are staying clear of breaking that law. And there are 4 defenses available: the defense of truth, the defense of expressing an opinion based on a religious text, and so on. Now, what the Online Harms Act would do, okay, so you've got criminal code hatred is illegal. That's already a crime. But what the Online Harms would do is they would empower the Canadian Human Rights Commission with new powers to prosecute Canadians for non-criminal hate speech. And here the definition of hate gets very, very subjective, because who knows the difference between hate versus dislike, or hate versus disdain. And so you're going to get the Canadian Human Rights Commission they're going to have bureaucrats that can prosecute. You could be ordered to pay up to $50,000 to the federal government, plus up to $20,000 to the complainant, plus complaints can be anonymous. And so this casts the net a whole lot wider than the law that we have right now, the criminal code prohibition on hate speech, where, by the way, the Crown has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that what you said was hateful, and that you intended to say something hateful, that you did it on purpose. Prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. With the new law, if the Online Harms Act, if Bill C-63 passes, you're going to get the Canadian Human Rights Commission to prosecute for non-criminal hate speech, where you don't get a criminal record, but it's very subjective. You'll be at the mercy of bureaucrats subjectively deciding what hate means, because it's not at all clear.
Now, the bill states, or at least the Attorney General has said, Ava Varani has said, that this definition of hate will be defined by the Supreme Court. Is this a definition the Supreme Court has already promulgated, or is this going to be a new definition that they promulgate?
So the Supreme Court of Canada dealt with a human rights case arising out of Saskatchewan. So this was like a non-criminal human rights prosecution against a fellow by the name of Bill Whatcott. Some of the viewers and listeners may have heard the name. He's a socially conservative activist who distributes flyers and pamphlets, which a lot of people find very offensive. It's his choice of words. A lot of people might agree with his viewpoint, but they don't like the way he expresses it. Anyway, he was getting prosecuted for distributing flyers in Saskatchewan that denounced gay sex as sinful, and in very polemical, strong language. And so when this ultimately got before the Supreme Court tried to come up with a definition of non-criminal hate speech. And I actually did a cut and paste of that section of the judgment, and they devoted over 4,000 words to trying to hair split by saying, well, promoting disdain and dislike is okay, but promoting detestation and vilification is not okay. Right? How do you know if what you're saying is going to be okay because it's promoting dislike of a particular group, but it's not crossing the line into disdain and vilification? It's just impossible. And so even after 4,000 words, the Supreme Court did a miserable job and failed to come up with any clarity. And that's not the fault of the Supreme Court. That would be you or I, anybody else. Try and write a concise definition of hatred that people can look at and actually know whether they're in line with the law or not. And it's going to be impossible because hate is an emotion. It's very subjective. You could hear something that you think is hateful, and I might say, no, David, that's not hateful. That's just an opinion. And vice versa. I could hear something and go, oh, that's hateful. You could say, no, John, that's not hateful. That's just an opinion. It's completely subjective.
Yeah, and it's a very slippery slope. I mean, I hate to use that phrase because it's overused, but it is. We're going nowhere good with this. I want to show a clip here because I talk to a lot of Americans because of the work I do as a journalist. I do a lot of work south of the border and have over the years. And a lot of American commentators, small c conservative commentators, are saying, you have got to be kidding about this Online Harms Act. It can't be real. This is a joke, right? This is a parody of Justin Trudeau at its worst, suggesting that we're going to have thought crimes in Canada. And of course, we'll get to that in a minute because I think your thoughts on that are excellent. But my old friend Steve Forbes is jumping on the bandwagon, and he released this video a couple of days ago, and I think it's excellent. And I'm just going to watch it because he not only brings up the thought crimes aspect, he brings up something interesting about Canada's Charter of Rights, which I'd like you to comment on.
Hello, I'm Steve Forbes, and this is What's Ahead, where you get the insights you need to better navigate these turbulent times. Freedom of speech is a bedrock right for Americans. It is guaranteed in the First Amendment of our Constitution. We tend to think other democracies enjoy the same privilege. Think again. The First Amendment is truly unique to us. Just look at our neighbor to the north, Canada. There, free speech is under Cuban-like assault. If the government of leftist Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has its way, not only will your right to write and speak what's on your mind be severely restricted, but also the government can jail you if it suspects you might say something that is unlawful. You heard that right. The mere suspicion that you might mouth or write words or phrases that the government deems to be unlawful is grounds to arrest you. Who could have imagined that what George Orwell labeled thought crimes in his classic novel 1984 about nightmarish life in a totalitarian world would be pursued by Canada of all places? Ostensibly, Canada protects free speech in what it calls, quote, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, end quote, which is part of the Canadian Constitution. In the Charter, quote, freedom of expression, end quote, is indeed guaranteed. But then comes the killer qualifier, as long as it remains, quote, within reasonable limits, end quote. You could drive a convoy of dump trucks through that loophole, and Canada's national and local governments have done just that. Over the years, people expressing politically incorrect observations have suffered serious legal assaults by government. Trudeau's new bill targets so-called hate speech on the internet. Anyone could file a complaint against someone or a business. The targeted individual could end up getting hit with house arrest, even if he or she hasn't actually committed a speech crime, but a judge decides there is a likelihood that such a person would do so. But the warning is clear. If Canada can suppress free speech, don't be surprised if more and more entities here in the U.S. try to emulate our neighbor to the north. I'm Steve Forbes. Thanks for listening. Do send in your comments and suggestions. I look forward to being with you soon again.
So Forbes, of course, media mogul, a former Republican presidential candidate. He's saying that this could happen in the U.S. because if it happens in Canada first, it can happen here. But he raises that question about our Charter of Rights and the phrase reasonable doubt. Has this left us in a very precarious position that we can't challenge this Online Harms Act as being unconstitutional? Does that put us in a precarious situation?
Well, excellent points. And I have to agree with what Steve Forbes said. One of the provisions that he mentioned was preemptive punishment. So if your neighbor fears that you might commit a speech crime in the future, you would have to appear before a provincial court judge. And if the judge believes your neighbor and fears that you might commit a speech crime, you could be placed under house arrest and wearing an ankle bracelet and observing a curfew. And if you don't agree to abide by those conditions, you could spend up to 2 years in jail. All of that without having committed any crime whatsoever, but preemptive punishment. So we might get into that more later, but I just want to say what Steve Forbes said is correct. Under Bill C-63, you could end up in prison without having committed a crime. It is possible under this legislation. Now, about the Section 1 of the Charter says that governments can, so governments would be the federal government, provincial governments in Canada, can violate your charter rights and freedoms if they show demonstrably with persuasive evidence that the freedom violating law is a reasonable limit that can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So I'll give you a concrete example. Okay, so we've got this hate speech, criminal code prohibition against hate speech. That was challenged by Jim Keekstra, who was a public school high school teacher in Alberta in a small town called Eckville. And in his social studies class, and maybe other classes too, I don't know, but in his social studies class, he said that there's a worldwide conspiracy of Jews that are causing wars, causing conflicts, making trouble, kind of very anti-Semitic stuff. And he was charged with willfully promoting hatred. And he challenged the law as invalid. And he almost won. The Supreme Court of Canada split 4-3. And there were 4 out of 7 justices sitting on that case. 4 out of 7 said that the criminal code prohibition on hate speech did violate our freedom of expression. I think that's pretty obvious. Nobody disagrees with that, right? If the criminal code says you can go to jail for saying certain things, that's obviously it's a restriction on your free expression. But they upheld it as demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. It was a reasonable limit. It had defenses in there. You could defend yourself on the basis of truth. There was a religious defense that if you were articulating an opinion based on a religious text. And so, but 3 out of 7 said no, they would have struck it down as an unreasonable limit and not justified. So this is, if the Online Harms Act passes into law, it could certainly be challenged by citizens, and it would be possible to get a court to strike down parts of the Online Harms Act or all of it as an unreasonable limit. So that door is open. How would the courts rule? Well, I'm not in the business of making predictions, but the court could go either way on this quite easily and could uphold legislation like that. Possibly the court could strike it down, but that's hypothetical.
Well, I think Steve latched on to the thought crimes component of this legislation, which I think most people that I've spoken to are most alarmed by. That it's not just hate speech, it's hate thought, or what the government or your neighbor down the street thinks you might be thinking. I find that frightening that we could come to that kind of juncture in this country that used to believe in free speech and is now literally echoing the darkest chapters of George Orwell's 1984. Do you find that frightening?
Well, it's frightening. The opposition leader Pier P quipped the other day. He says, does Justin Trudeau view the George Orwell's book titled 1984? Does he view 1984 as a warning or as an instruction manual? Was a question that was asked. But it's if the Justice Minister Arif Virani was a third person on the show, if we were having a 3-way discussion, he would say, well, you're getting upset over nothing because a judge would only order house arrest and curfew and ankle bracelet if the judge believed that there were actual reasonable grounds to support your neighbor's belief or your neighbor's fear. So it's not a slam dunk. He would say this is not a slam dunk. It's not like your neighbor files a complaint and then next thing you know, you're placed under house arrest because the neighbor would have to have well-founded grounds, would have to have a good reason for fearing that you're about to commit a hate crime, and and there's a good chance that your neighbor would fail to persuade the judge, and then you would be on your way. Now, I would respond to the justice minister and say, well, you might be right. Maybe 90% or maybe 99% of these complaints will get dismissed, but the process is the punishment. And this is something that we have to take into account. So a lot of Canadians, if the Online Harms Act, if C-63 passes, they're not going to necessarily be afraid of being placed under house arrest because, the chance of that's pretty slim. But there's a far bigger chance that you have to appear before a judge and hopefully persuade the judge that you're not going to commit a speech crime. And it's that fear. People don't, and it's the same with the human rights complaints. You're going to have a lot of frivolous human rights complaints. When Scotland passed hate speech legislation just a few weeks ago, on the first day, they were flooded with, I don't know what the number was, 5,000. There were so many complaints that it's going to be hard to get through it. So same thing with the Online Harms Act. If the Canadian Human Rights Commission gets the new powers to prosecute non-criminal hate speech, if they get flooded with 10,000, 20,000 complaints, they might get so bogged down that so it's not the high risk of being ordered to pay $50,000 to the federal government and on top of that, $20,000 to a complainant. It's not the risk of having to pay $70,000 that's frightening. It's the risk of getting prosecuted, that if you don't watch what you say, you're going to get a letter in the mail or a letter by email saying, dear Mr. Krayden, it's been reported to us that you said such and such on this date, this time, this forum, this venue, this podcast, or on your website. It's been reported to us. And we believe that you've violated the human rights legislation, and so prosecution has been commenced. You're entitled to retain counsel if you wish, but nobody wants to get that kind of a letter. So that's the chilling effect. If this passes, it's going to have a huge chilling effect on expression in Canada, because people fear the process, even if the risk of the punishment might be small.
Well, when I first read through this bill, my first impulse was to say, this is a mechanism for self-censorship, because they create this whole layer of bureaucracy, this agency that's going to be overseeing hate speech. And they've created this online censorship czar. That's what I'm calling this person. They call it an ombudsperson that's going to be overseeing all of this. And the object of this, of course, is to threaten people, to say, just a minute, you've posted something or your broadcast might be deemed hate speech. Why don't you moderate your approach? Why don't you change it? Why don't you take it down? And that'll be the end of your problems. So therefore, I go back and say, well, do I really want legal entanglements over this program? Maybe I'll just take it down, or maybe I'll change what I said. And there's a chill factor here that is enormous, even if it never gets to court, even if it never is a case of being charged. I'm self-censoring myself now because I'm worried about a judge coming to me. I'm worried about the thought police at my door. I'm worried about being arrested for something I put on perhaps 6 months ago or a year ago that I put up as a broadcast, or something I said in a column 15 years ago. And believe me, there's probably things that I said 15 years ago that today might be adjudicated as hate speech, although I would strongly deny that and fight against that definition. But I find it's worrisome that the government now expects us to essentially self-censor our speech. I find this to be, we have libel chill. This is now hate speech chill.
Well, libel chill at least is between private actors, amongst private actors, and so people are entitled to a good reputation. So if you said, I'm just going to pick a name, Ralph Smith. My apology to any Ralph Smiths out there. If you said, well, Ralph Smith is a crook, he's dishonest, he's treacherous in business, he cheats people out of money, whatever, stuff like that, Ralph Smith is entitled to a good reputation, so he could sue you. But that's a private action between two individuals, and it doesn't touch on your political viewpoints about what you might think about a politician, what you might think about a government policy, what you might think about a controversial topic, like you take this whole transgenderism stuff that's being pushed on kids. That's a hot potato. It's or you've got immigration, you've got Aboriginal policy, you've got criminal justice issues, etc. So the defamation law is a bit of a chill to make you think twice before you say something really nasty about your neighbor, because your neighbor could sue you if it's defamatory and if it's false. That's fairly limited. It just means you got to watch out. If you're saying something specific about another human being, you better make sure it's true. Otherwise, you better exercise caution. So you don't just run around saying that somebody's dishonest or a crook or a thief or whatever. But the Online Harms Act, as you pointed out, Dave, is it's going to get a lot of social media platforms to remove content because they want to avoid these hefty draconian penalties that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines and penalties. And the way that's going to be done is if Bill C-63, if the Online Harms Act passes, the federal cabinet will get new censorship powers to create censorship rules about what cannot be said and also what must be said. You can say that as well. And those, like all cabinet orders, regulations, they are passed, they are deliberated in secret by the federal cabinet. And you find out about it once it's proclaimed into force. You don't find out about it ahead of time. They are not approved by Parliament. They're not debated in Parliament. Parliament does not vote on them. So the passing regulations is done in secret by the federal cabinet. And so the Online Harms Act gives the current and future federal cabinets this new power. And then we're going to have this Digital Safety Commission. Watch out for safety, because during the French Revolution, during the Reign of Terror, 1793, it was the Committee of Public Safety that chopped off the heads of over 16,000 Frenchmen. So safety is dangerous. Just be careful. So we're going to have a Digital Safety Commission with bureaucrats to monitor the social media websites to see if they're complying with the federal cabinet regulations. And you're going to see a ton of self-censorship there, where it won't be the government, it'll be the social media platforms that are going to like remove all kinds of content because they don't want to be slapped with massive fines.
Well, the Trudeau government has already hired more civil servants, more government employees than all previous governments in the past. And this is another excuse to start hiring bureaucrats. So we have this Digital Safety Commission and this online safety czar. This is going to be another layer of bureaucracy that's going to be set loose on us, as if we don't have enough government in this country. We're already inundated with bureaucracy, and Trudeau just feeds off of it. So when I hear Pier P talk about common sense approaches and talk about cutting the size of government and regulations, I'm relieved because I hope he's serious. But you mentioned the words he spoke the other day at the Canada Strong and Free conference, and I was heartened by this. And I'm just going to play that now. I'm very excited about what today offers. And I'm going to a meeting tonight with the Justice Foundation that it's centered upon the Online Harms Act, because we need to hear more about this. But I want you guys to hear this fantastic quote from Conservative leader Pier P, who was at the Canada Strong and Free convention today. That's the old Manning Center conference. And unfortunately, I'm not there today.
This would have been unimaginable 8 years ago. Unimaginable. It would have been unimaginable 8 years ago, before Justin Trudeau, to think that not only would he pass a law to control what you can see and say on the internet, but he would then put forward another law which could put you under house arrest or a peace bond under suspicion of something unacceptable you might say in the future. You know, this guy, if he had read 1984, he would have thought it was an instruction manual and not a warning.
So yes, excellent words. I was so happy to hear him say that. I have been on his back lately to say more about this bill, to do something productive about it, to ensure Canadians he's opposed to it, that they're going to try to stop it in the next 18 months, and they would repeal it if it is passed. He said similar things about bills C11 and C18. He has not said enough about this. So I was relieved to hear him speak this way last week, because frankly, I am disappointed in the response, not just from the Conservative Party, but from journalists out there who have said very little. And a lot of my old friends in the mainstream media, where I used to work, are saying very little. Once again, very afraid to rock the boat, to upset Justin Trudeau, who's subsidizing so much of the legacy media. And I'm expecting better, because this goes to the very heart of free speech, which is what journalism is all about. We need the freedom to report the truth. We need the freedom to offend people occasionally. The truth offends. The truth is not always something that's going to mollify everybody. And my God, if we'd use offense as our yardstick as to what we can say, very little would have been done in history. There's a lot of offending actions.
Well, absolutely.
In history.
You look at William Wilberforce and the fight against slavery, and today in Canada and most other countries, presumably, the whole idea of slavery is anathema, and you get close to 100% of the population is against it. You have to remember that 300 years ago, it was the opposite. Slavery had been accepted in every country, every civilization, on every continent. There was slavery or some form of servitude. Okay, there's different kinds of slavery, but you might have serfdom in Russia, or but amongst the indigenous peoples, North and South America, amongst the African peoples, the Arabs, all across the world, you had the Romans, of course, the Greeks. You had this some form of slavery, and it was considered to be normal. It was not considered to be morally objectionable. And so you had these people who were deemed to be, crazy, kooky, and a little bit evil too. William Wilberforce and a bunch of Quakers in Britain started on this project of getting rid of, first they got rid of the slave trade that was taking place with the ships capturing the blacks in Africa, shipping them across the Atlantic, and then taken to the Caribbean, and then taking cotton and tobacco and rum from the Caribbean back to Britain, and so on. They got rid of the slave trade. That took 25 years of lobbying, and then another 25 years thereafter to get rid of slavery itself. But it was an uphill battle. And the same could go for women's right to vote. That was considered to be completely nuts. The same on abortion, and that debate is not settled. The gay marriage, you name it. On all of these issues, if we don't have a right to offend, if a right to not be offended cannot coexist with free speech.
Yes, I would agree completely, and it's a large job ahead. I believe we have to fight this vigorously. Are you doing more town hall meetings like the one you did here in Ottawa last week?
Yes, next week I will be doing one in Vancouver and one in Langley, British Columbia, and I anticipate doing more of them in the weeks ahead. And when I was in Ottawa last week, when we met briefly in person, on Wednesday, April the 10th, I delivered 55,500 signatures of people who have signed the petition against the Online Harms Act. If anybody is hearing this or viewing this, you could go to www.jccf.ca, so Justice Center Constitutional Freedoms, jccf.ca. Sign the petition. We want to deliver another batch, and we're just going to keep on fighting away, and you might get changes to the bill before it's passed. But if not, then we keep on fighting for its repeal. Perseverance is the key. Quitters never win, and winners never quit, and so you have to be persevering over the course of months and years if you want to achieve what your goals are.
Well, on that line, I guess we'll get you out of here. Thank you so much for appearing today and for the work you've done, not only on this issue, but so many other issues that are fundamental, I believe, to Canadian freedom. And you're so right that the process is the punishment. Even if this thing doesn't put people in jail, it's going to be such a nuisance factor, being hauled in front of human rights tribunal, being subject to penalties, financial and otherwise, constant threats. And I think what you're doing is going to help reverse this. But we got to energize Canada. Stay in touch. And if there's anything we can do here, and for the organs that I write for, I tell you, they're dedicated to stopping this legislation because they know it's tantamount to ending free speech in Canada and a free press. And without either of those, we're not a democracy. We're not a democracy. So thanks so much for joining me today, John, and stay in touch and keep up the fight.